Deep in the Cascade Mountains of Oregon, where fog clings to pine needles like forgotten memories, Harold Whitman raised his chainsaw for the last time. The century-old oak had stood sentinel over his cabin for decades, but root rot was threatening his foundation. At 74, he figured this would be his final major project before winter set in. The tree crashed with a thunder that echoed through the valley, but as Harold cleared the massive trunk, his blood went cold. Beneath twisted roots lay something impossible, a rusted metal hatch bearing a faded government seal he recognized all too well. For 40 years, Harold had lived as a simple mountain hermit, chopping wood and living off the land. What no one knew was that Dr. Harold Whitman had once been the lead researcher on Project Deepwood, a classified experiment that officially never existed. He'd buried those files, that life, that terrible mistake deep in his past. Now someone was coming up his mountain road, someone who knew exactly what lay beneath that tree. The question that would determine whether Harold lived to see another sunrise was simple. Had they come to silence him or to unleash what he'd spent decades keeping buried? Harold's weathered hands trembled as he knelt beside the exposed hatch. The Department of Defense emblem was barely visible beneath decades of rust and root damage, but those angular letters still made his stomach clench. DODCL-7 to 1952. Classification Level 7. The kind of clearance that erased people from existence. He'd chosen this spot deliberately when he'd fled the program, built his cabin directly above the abandoned access point, planted that oak sapling himself to hide what lay beneath. The tree had been his silent guardian, its roots gradually obscuring the entrance to a facility that housed nightmares better left buried. The rumble of a diesel engine grew louder on the winding mountain road. Harold estimated maybe 10 minutes before they reached his property. He brushed dirt from the hatch's surface, revealing more details he'd hoped never to see again. The biometric scanner was cracked but intact. The heavy-duty locks that had once secured humanity's safety hung broken and corroded. His mind raced back to 1972, the night everything went wrong. The screaming from Sub-Level 3. Dr. Chen's panicked voice over the intercom. Containment breach. All personnel evacuate immediately. The smell of ozone and something else, something organic and wrong that still haunted his dreams. Harold had been the last one out that night, sealing the facility behind him. The official story claimed a chemical leak, tragic but contained. 12 researchers dead, facility permanently closed. Harold Whitman, brilliant young biochemist, suffered a complete nervous breakdown and disappeared into the wilderness. The truth was far worse. He stood slowly, joints protesting after decades of hard mountain living. His cabin sat 50 yards away, looking innocent with its split-log construction and moss-covered roof. But Harold knew better. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath loose floorboards, lay the only remaining records of what Project Deepwood had actually accomplished. The engine's sound shifted as the vehicle navigated the final switchback. Harold caught a glimpse of black paint through the trees. Government plates, most likely. The kind of people who cleaned up loose ends and filed reports that would never see daylight. He had two choices: run deeper into the mountains and hope his old legs could carry him far enough, or face whatever was coming with the dignity of a man who'd already died once in these woods. Harold chose a third option. Moving with surprising agility for his age, he grabbed a fallen branch and began sweeping away the remaining dirt from the hatch. If they wanted what was down there, they'd have to go through him first, and Harold Whitman, both versions of him, had no intention of making it easy. The biometric scanner flickered to life when he brushed against it, somehow still drawing power after 5 decades. A weak red light pulsed steadily, like a sleeping heartbeat. The system didn't recognize his aged fingerprints, but Harold had always been resourceful. He pulled out his pocket knife and drew it across his thumb, letting fresh blood drip onto the scanner's surface. DNA didn't age the same way fingerprints did. The lock mechanism groaned and clicked. Ancient hydraulics wheezed as the hatch began to open, revealing a ladder descending into absolute darkness. The smell that wafted up made Harold gag, not decay, but something artificial and sharp that burned his nostrils. They were still alive down there. The black SUV rounded the final curve, and Harold could see two figures in dark suits through the windshield. Professional, serious, the kind of people who'd been waiting 40 years for this moment. Harold looked down into the facility one last time, then at his simple cabin, then at the approaching vehicle. He'd spent 4 decades preparing for this day, knowing it would eventually come. The only question now was whether the scared young scientist who'd fled this place in 1972 had grown wise enough to handle what was coming next. The SUV's doors opened simultaneously. Harold squared his shoulders and waited. Harold's weathered hands trembled as he descended the rusted ladder, each rung groaning under his weight like the bones in his arthritic knees. The air grew colder with every step, carrying the metallic scent of old machinery and something else, something that made his stomach clench with 40-year-old memories he'd spent decades trying to bury. The beam from his flashlight cut through the darkness below, revealing glimpses of concrete walls and the skeletal remains of what had once been a state-of-the-art laboratory. When his boots finally touched solid ground, Harold stood motionless for a long moment, listening to the silence that pressed against his eardrums like a living thing. The facility stretched before him in the pale circle of his light, sterile corridors branching off like arteries from a dead heart. Emergency lighting strips hung dark and useless from the ceiling, their red backup bulbs long since burned out. Harold's breath misted in the frigid air as he moved deeper into the complex muscle memory guiding his feet along paths he'd walked thousands of times as a younger man. Project Mindbridge. The name echoed in his thoughts unbidden, carrying with it the weight of classified briefings and sleepless nights spent hunched over equations that should never have been solved. They'd been so proud then, so certain they were pushing the boundaries of human consciousness for the greater good. Dr. Elizabeth Chen had called it the next evolutionary step. Dr. Marcus Webb had dubbed it weaponizing thought itself. Harold had simply called it a mistake. His flashlight beam swept across a blast door hanging ajar, its massive steel frame twisted as if some tremendous force had wrenched it open from the inside. Beyond lay Laboratory 7, the heart of their research, where the final experiments had taken place, where everything had gone so catastrophically wrong. The air grew thicker as he approached, heavy with an oppressive weight that had nothing to do with atmospheric pressure. Harold's chest tightened, and for a moment he considered turning back, climbing those rusted rungs to the surface and pretending the past could stay buried. But the tire tracks in the mud above told a different story. Someone else had found this place, and that changed everything. Inside Laboratory 7, banks of computer terminals sat dark and silent, their screens reflecting his flashlight like dead eyes. Cables snaked across the floor in chaotic tangles, leading to examination tables equipped with restraints that made Harold's skin crawl. At the far end of the room, a massive sphere of brushed metal dominated the space, the neural amplification chamber still intact after all these years. Harold approached the sphere with reluctant steps, his free hand unconsciously moving to the scar that ran along his left temple. The surgical site had healed decades ago, but phantom pain still flared whenever he was stressed or afraid. The implant they'd placed there, a prototype neural interface no bigger than a grain of rice, had been removed along with most of his memories of the final months of the project. Most, but not all. He could still remember the screaming. A soft clicking sound echoed from somewhere behind him, and Harold spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. The flashlight beam swept across empty air before settling on a security camera mounted high on the wall. Its red recording light blinked steadily, an electronic heartbeat in the darkness. Impossible. The facility had been powered down for 40 years, its generators silent, its backup systems long dead. Harold's mouth went dry as he realized what this meant. Someone had restored power to at least part of the complex, someone who knew exactly what lay buried beneath his mountain. The clicking continued, rhythmic and deliberate, and Harold realized it wasn't coming from the camera at all. He followed the sound deeper into the laboratory, past banks of monitoring equipment and specimen storage units that he prayed were empty. The clicking grew louder, more insistent, until he traced it to its source, a computer terminal that shouldn't have been functioning, its screen glowing with pale green text that scrolled endlessly upward. Harold leaned closer, squinting at the words streaming across the display. Bioelectric readings, neural pathway mappings, consciousness transfer protocols. All the technical jargon of Project Mindbridge, displayed as if the experiments were still ongoing, still collecting data from subjects that should have been dead for decades. At the bottom of the screen, a single line of text appeared that made Harold's blood turn to ice water in his veins. "Welcome back, Dr. Harrison. We've been waiting." The computer knew who he was. After 40 years of hiding, 40 years of living under an assumed name in self-imposed exile, somehow the facility's systems had recognized him the moment he'd entered. Harold stumbled backward, his flashlight dropping to clatter against the concrete floor, its beam spinning wildly across the walls. In the strobing light, he caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows at the far end of the laboratory, a figure standing perfectly still, watching him with eyes that reflected his flashlight like mirrors. Harold's scream died in his throat as he recognized the face staring back at him, a face he'd seen every morning in his shaving mirror for the past 4 decades. It was his own. The metallic tang of old air hit Harold's nostrils as he descended the narrow staircase, each step echoing in the darkness below. His arthritic fingers gripped the cold handrail, muscle memory guiding him down steps he hadn't touched in 37 years. The emergency lighting had long since failed, but Harold's flashlight beam revealed walls lined with the same sterile white tiles he remembered from his nightmares. At the bottom, he paused before a heavy steel door marked with radiation symbols and government warnings. The biometric scanner beside it was dark, its red lead long dead. Harold pulled a keyring from his pocket, keys he'd carried everywhere for 4 decades but never used. The manual override turned with surprising ease, well-oiled mechanisms betraying recent maintenance. The door swung open with a pneumatic hiss. The laboratory beyond was exactly as he'd left it, preserved in the mountain's embrace like a tomb. Stainless steel workbenches gleamed under his flashlight. Equipment covered by plastic sheeting formed ghostly silhouettes along the walls. And there, in the center of the room, stood the containment unit, a cylindrical chamber 15 feet tall, its viewing window clouded with age. Harold's breath caught. The status panel still glowed with a faint amber light. After all these years, the backup power was still functioning. They'd built this place to last centuries, and apparently they'd succeeded. He approached the console slowly, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the sterile silence. The readings were stable: temperature, pressure, electromagnetic containment field strength. Everything exactly within parameters. Whatever slept inside that cylinder was still sleeping. A sound from above made him freeze. Footsteps on the wooden floor of his cabin, deliberate and measured. Harold killed his flashlight and pressed himself against the wall, listening. 3 distinct sets of boots moving through his living room. They were searching for something. His hands trembling, Harold felt along the wall until he found what he was looking for, a panel that slid aside to reveal a bank of monitors. He activated the surface surveillance system, and grainy black and white images filled the screens. 3 figures in dark tactical gear were systematically tearing apart his home. One was examining the disturbed earth around the oak tree with a handheld device that beeped softly. They knew. Somehow, after all these years of silence, they knew he'd opened the facility. Harold's mind raced. The official records claimed Project Morpheus had been terminated in 1987, all materials destroyed, all personnel reassigned. But 5 people had known the truth. 5 people who'd helped fake the destruction while secretly maintaining the containment protocols. Harold was the last of them now. Marcus had died in a car accident in '92. Elena succumbed to cancer in 2003. Both of the others had met equally unremarkable ends, their deaths separated by years but linked by the secret they'd shared. The figure by the oak tree was now examining the hidden entrance, running gloved hands over the concealed mechanism. It would only be a matter of time before they found the activation sequence. Harold moved quickly through the laboratory, muscle memory guiding him to storage locker 7 Alpha. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a .45 caliber pistol and 3 magazines of ammunition. He'd hoped never to touch these again, but some preparations you make and pray you'll never need. The weapon felt heavier than he remembered. On the monitor, one of the figures was speaking into a radio. Harold couldn't hear the words, but the body language was clear. They were calling for backup. More would be coming. He checked the containment unit's readings one more time. Stable. Whatever they'd created down here 40 years ago, whatever hybrid monstrosity had cost so many lives to capture and contain, it remained dormant. The sedation protocols were still functioning, the neural suppressors still active. But if these people breached the facility, if they tried to move the subject or worse, tried to wake it up, the consequences would be catastrophic. Harold had seen what happened when the containment failed during the initial experiments. An entire research team gone in 17 seconds. They'd barely managed to re-establish control before it reached the surface level. The footage still haunted him. Grainy security camera images of something that moved like liquid shadow, reshaping itself as it consumed everything in its path. The footsteps above had stopped. Harold glanced at the monitors and saw empty rooms. The searchers had found the entrance. He moved to the laboratory's rear exit, another secret he'd hoped never to use. The emergency tunnel would take him 300 yards through the mountain to a concealed opening behind a rockfall. From there, he could reach his truck and the satellite phone hidden in its spare tire well. But first, he activated the final protocol he'd hoped never to implement. His fingers moved across a hidden keypad, entering a sequence burned into his memory. Throughout the facility, amber lights turned to red. The automated message began broadcasting on frequency 7.23, a signal that would reach exactly one person if she was still alive and still listening. The last failsafe was now in motion. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Harold descended the metal staircase, each step echoing in the confined space like a countdown to judgment. The air grew colder with every foot deeper, carrying the sterile scent of recycled atmosphere and something else, something organic and wrong that made his stomach clench with recognition. At the bottom, a heavy steel door stood ajar, its electronic lock blinking red in the darkness beyond. Harold's fingers trembled as he pushed it open, revealing a corridor that stretched into shadows. Emergency lighting cast pale green pools along the walls, illuminating doors marked with numbers and symbols he remembered from nightmares. Room 7, Room 12, Room 15. He stopped at Room 23, his breath catching. The nameplate was still there, tarnished but readable. Dr. Margaret Chen, project director, his wife's office. The woman who had died in a car accident 3 weeks after they'd sealed this place, an accident he'd never quite believed was accidental. Harold forced himself to continue down the corridor, past the laboratories where they'd played God with human consciousness, past the observation rooms where they'd watched their subjects writhe in agony or bliss, depending on the day's variables. The Prometheus Project, they'd called it, bringing fire to mankind. What hubris! At the corridor's end, the main laboratory doors stood open. Inside, banks of computers lined the walls, their screens dark but for a single terminal that cast blue light across rows of cylindrical tanks. Harold's blood turned to ice water. The tanks weren't empty. Suspended in viscous fluid, connected to networks of tubes and wires, floated 3 human forms. Their faces were peaceful, almost serene, but Harold could see the telltale neural interfaces at the base of their skulls, the same ports they'd developed 50 years ago to bridge organic minds with quantum processors. "Jesus," he whispered, stumbling forward. The nearest tank held a young woman, maybe 25, her dark hair drifting like seaweed around her pale features. The nameplate read, Subject 847, neural integration 94%, status stable. The second tank contained a middle-aged man with graying temples. Subject 848, neural integration 89%, status declining. Harold watched in horror as the man's eyes moved beneath closed lids, rapid and desperate, as if trapped in an endless nightmare. The third tank made Harold's knees buckle. The subject was elderly, perhaps 70, with a face Harold recognized from newspaper obituaries he'd read 3 years ago. Dr. Robert Henley, former NSA director, reportedly dead from a heart attack. The nameplate confirmed Harold's worst fears. Subject 849, neural integration, 97%, status transcendent. A soft chime echoed through the laboratory. The active terminal flickered, and text began scrolling across the screen. Neural integration protocol, active. Subjects 847 to 849, consciousness transfer 78% complete. Estimated time to full absorption 72 hours. Initiating retention sequence. Harold lurched toward the terminal, his arthritic fingers flying over the keyboard with muscle memory 4 decades old. The system responded to his touch, recognizing his biometric signature even after all these years. Security clearance accepted. Welcome back, Dr. Harold Morrison. The full horror revealed itself in cascading data streams. Someone had continued the Prometheus project, refined it, perfected it. The neural integration process they'd barely understood in the 1970s had evolved into something far more sophisticated and terrifying. The subjects weren't just connected to the quantum processes, their consciousness was being systematically extracted, digitized, and absorbed into a vast networked intelligence. More files opened unbidden. Harold watched recruitment videos showing the 3 subjects in their former lives. Brilliant scientists and government officials, all reported dead in the past 5 years. All secretly brought here to feed whatever digital deity someone was creating in the quantum substrate. A new window appeared. Next phase candidates. Harold's own photograph stared back at him, along with his complete biographical data. The file noted his involvement in the original project, his specialized knowledge, and something that made his blood freeze: acquisition authorized, extraction team deployed. Footsteps echoed from the corridor above. Multiple sets, moving with military precision. Harold's hands shook as he accessed the facility's security feeds. 6 figures in black tactical gear descended the main staircase, their faces hidden behind advanced night vision equipment. They moved like professionals, like people who'd done this before. Harold looked at the sleeping faces in their tanks, at the data streams showing their memories being systematically harvested, and made a choice that went against every survival instinct screaming in his head. He began typing commands into the system, initiating emergency protocols that would flood the quantum cores with electromagnetic pulses. The footsteps grew closer. Harold could hear radio chatter now, brief coded exchanges that meant they'd found his entry point. In minutes, maybe seconds, they'd be through that steel door. His finger hovered over the final command key, the one that would destroy 50 years of research and probably kill the 3 subjects in the process. Their bodies might die, but how much of their minds remained to save? The laboratory door exploded inward in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. The steel door groaned on rusted hinges as Harold descended into darkness that had remained undisturbed for over 40 years. His flashlight beam cut through stale air thick with dust and the metallic tang of decay. Each step down the concrete stairwell echoed like a heartbeat, reminding him of the night he'd sealed this place and sworn never to return. The narrow corridor at the bottom stretched deeper into the mountain than his light could penetrate. Harold's arthritic fingers trembled as he traced along the wall, finding the emergency lighting panel by muscle memory. The switches clicked with surprising authority, and one by one, fluorescent tubes flickered to reluctant life, revealing a pristine hallway that belonged to another era. Government-issue linoleum, the color of institutional green that haunted federal buildings in the 1970s, stretched ahead unmarked by time. The air circulation system somehow continued operating all these years, powered by the geothermal generators he'd helped design. Even the small details remained exactly as he'd left them: the orientation arrows on the floor, the radiation warning symbols on select doors, the emergency evacuation procedures posted in neat government typeface. Harold moved past Laboratory B, where Dr. Patricia Vance had conducted her botanical experiments, past the medical wing where Dr. Chen had monitored their vital signs with equipment that seemed miraculous then, but would be considered primitive now, past the communications center where they'd received their final orders on that terrible October night in 1981. His destination lay at the end of the corridor, Laboratory A, the heart of Project Lazarus. The biometric scanner beside the door should have been dead, but the red light still pulsed steadily. Harold pressed his palm against the glass surface, wondering if 4 decades had changed his handprint enough to deny him access to his own work. The scanner hummed, processing, and then the light turned green, the heavy door unsealed with a pneumatic hiss. The laboratory looked exactly as he'd left it, preserved like a shrine to abandoned science. Banks of computers filled one wall, their screens dark but their indicator lights still blinking. Specimen containers lined metal shelving units, their contents floating in preservation fluid that had somehow remained clear. And in the center of the room, surrounded by monitoring equipment and feeding tubes, stood the isolation chamber. Harold approached it slowly, his flashlight now unnecessary in the laboratory's bright overhead lighting. The chamber was constructed of reinforced glass and steel, about the size of a phone booth, filled with a translucent gel that maintained perfect stasis. And suspended within that gel, unchanged by time, was Subject 7. The boy appeared to be sleeping, auburn hair floating gently in the suspension medium, pale skin unmarked by age or decay, chest rising and falling in the impossibly slow rhythm they'd calibrated to extend cellular regeneration indefinitely. He looked exactly as he had at age 12, when the accident had changed everything. Harold's legs gave out, and he collapsed into the nearest chair. Seeing Tommy alive, if this could be called living, brought back the weight of every decision, every compromise, every lie he'd told himself to justify what they'd done here. The boy had been dead for 6 minutes before they'd gotten him into the chamber, clinically dead from massive trauma after falling into the prototype reactor core. But Dr. Vance's regenerative serum, combined with the electromagnetic field generators Harold had designed, had done something unprecedented. They'd brought him back. Not fully alive, not truly dead, but something in between, something that contradicted every law of biology and physics they understood. Tommy's cells had begun repairing themselves at an accelerated rate, while the suspension gel slowed his metabolism to near stasis. His brain activity had stabilized at levels consistent with deep REM sleep, but scans showed cognitive function far beyond normal human parameters. The government had been ecstatic. They'd increased funding, brought in additional specialists, demanded larger test subjects. But Harold and his team had recognized the horror of what they'd created. They weren't saving lives. They were trapping souls in an endless limbo between existence and oblivion. A soft chime echoed through the laboratory, and Harold's blood froze. The main computer system was activating, responding to his presence with protocols he'd programmed decades ago. Text began scrolling across the nearest monitor. Biometric scan confirmed, administrator access granted. Dr. Harold Whitmore, project director, days since last access, 14,862. Subject status, stable, awaiting instructions. Harold stared at the screen, remembering the final entry in his research journal. Some discoveries are too dangerous to pursue, too terrible to share, and too precious to destroy. He'd thought sealing the facility would be enough, that time and neglect would eventually solve the problem he couldn't bring himself to address. But Tommy was still here, still caught in the space between life and death, still waiting for someone to decide his fate. And now, someone else knew about this place. Harold reached for the keyboard with hands that had aged while his greatest subject remained frozen in time, and began typing the commands he'd hoped never to use. Harold's arthritic fingers trembled as he powered up the facility's main terminal. The screens flickered to life with an eerie blue glow that painted shadows across his weathered face. He hadn't accessed these systems in over 15 years, not since his last quarterly check to ensure everything remained dormant. But someone had been here recently. The dust patterns on the keyboards told him that much. The authentication process required both his biometric signature and a 20-digit code burned into his memory decades ago. As the system accepted his credentials, a chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the underground facility's perpetual cold. The access logs showed unauthorized entry 3 days prior. Impossible, he whispered to the humming machines. The only other person who possessed clearance had been Dr. Sarah Chen, and she'd died in that car accident outside Spokane 12 years ago, or so he'd been told. Harold navigated through the security footage archives, his heart hammering against his ribs. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m., 3 nights ago, exactly when he'd heard those strange sounds that had initially drawn him to investigate the oak tree. A figure in dark clothing moved through the corridors with purpose, avoiding the camera angles with practiced precision. But in one brief moment, as the intruder passed beneath Emergency Light Station 7, Harold caught a glimpse of a face. Sarah Chen. Impossible, yet undeniable. The same sharp cheekbones, the distinctive scar above her left eyebrow from their laboratory accident in 1987. She'd aged, certainly, but it was definitely Sarah moving through his facility like she owned it. His mind reeled with implications. If Sarah had faked her death, if she'd been operating in shadow for over a decade, then everything Harold thought he knew about Project Lazarus was wrong. The official story was that the program had been terminated in 1989, all research destroyed, all personnel relocated with new identities. Harold had believed he was the sole guardian of this buried secret. But the deeper question gnawed at him. What had Sarah been after? Harold pulled up the access records for that night. She'd spent most of her time in Lab 3, the genetics wing where they'd made their most significant breakthroughs. More troubling, she'd accessed the cryogenic storage units. Harold's blood ran cold as he realized what that meant. He shuffled through the facility's corridors, past dormant equipment that represented humanity's most ambitious and terrifying scientific achievement. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in harsh clinical white. Each step echoed with memories of younger days, when these halls buzzed with activity and dangerous optimism. Lab 3 stood exactly as he'd left it 15 years ago, except for one critical detail. Storage Unit 7 was empty. Harold stared at the vacant chamber where sample X-47 had been preserved in suspended animation for 34 years. The most successful specimen from their experiments, the one that had convinced the government to shut down the entire project when they realized what they'd actually created. His secure satellite phone buzzed. Only 3 people had this number, and 2 of them were supposed to be dead. Harold! Sarah's voice carried across the years unchanged, though now it held an edge he didn't remember. I thought you were dead. I needed you to think that. I needed everyone to think that. Where is X-47? A pause, somewhere safe, somewhere it can fulfill its intended purpose. Sarah, you know what that thing is capable of. We agreed. You agreed. She cut him off. You were always too afraid of the implications, but I've spent 12 years watching the world tear itself apart while we kept the solution locked away in your mountain. Harold sank into a lab chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 74 years. It's not a solution, Sarah. It's an abomination. The psychological profile alone has been refined. I've been working, Harold, improving the original design. X-47 represents the next evolutionary step for humanity, and you've been playing cemetery caretaker while people suffer. Through the lab's observation window, Harold could see the empty storage units that had once housed their other specimens. The failures, The things that had convinced him this research should never see daylight. "The government agents who've been sniffing around," Harold said. "That's because of you. They don't know anything yet, but they're close, too close." Her voice hardened. "I need you to destroy all remaining evidence in the facility. Everything except the research data in Vault 12. Transfer that to the coordinates I'm sending you. I won't help you unleash that thing. You don't have a choice, old friend, because if you don't cooperate, I'll make sure those government agents find more than just an empty facility under your tree." The line went dead, leaving Harold alone with the humming machines and the weight of a secret that had just become infinitely more dangerous. Through the facility's ventilation system, he heard something that made his blood freeze. Footsteps echoing from the entrance tunnel. Someone else was coming. Harold's hands trembled as he descended the familiar metal rungs, each step echoing in the narrow shaft like a countdown to his reckoning. The facility's emergency lighting cast sickly yellow pools on the concrete walls, and the air grew thicker with each level he dropped. 47 years since he'd last made this journey, yet muscle memory guided him through the darkness. The main corridor stretched before him like a tomb, lined with doors that had once buzzed with activity. Now they stood silent, sealed monuments to ambition and horror. Harold's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating faded warning signs and biohazard symbols that still made his stomach clench. The generator's steady hum provided the only company as he walked deeper into his past. Room 7, Alpha. The designation was barely visible on the corroded placard, but Harold would have found this door blindfolded. His security card, yellowed with age but still magnetic, slid into the reader with a soft beep. The locks disengaged with a pneumatic hiss that transported him instantly back to 1976. The laboratory lay exactly as he'd left it during his final, desperate evacuation. Equipment draped in plastic sheeting like funeral shrouds, computer terminals dark and silent, and there, in the center of it all, the containment unit that had consumed 5 years of his life and haunted every year since. The cylindrical chamber stood 8 feet tall, constructed of reinforced titanium and lined with electromagnetic field generators. Its viewing window remained clouded with condensation, obscuring whatever lay within. Harold approached slowly, his breathing shallow. The digital readout showed green across all systems, temperature maintained, power stable, containment integrity at 100%. "Still sleeping," he whispered, though he knew sleep wasn't the right word for what existed inside. Harold activated his tablet and began downloading the facility's recent activity logs. Someone had been here, multiple someones, based on the access records. The timestamps showed regular visits over the past 6 months, always during new moon phases when the darkness was deepest. Clever, professional. The data files painted a picture that made his blood run cold. Genetic samples had been extracted, cellular analysis conducted. Most damning of all, replication attempts had been authorized under protocols he'd never seen before. Someone wasn't just studying Subject 23, they were trying to reproduce it. A soft chime from the corridor made Harold freeze. The motion sensors had detected movement near the elevator shaft. He switched off his flashlight and listened to the darkness, counting heartbeats. Footsteps, definitely human, moving with practiced stealth through the facility's maze. Harold slipped behind a bank of monitoring equipment, his arthritic joints protesting the sudden movement. Through the lab's reinforced window, he watched 3 figures emerge from the shadows. They wore tactical gear and carried military-grade equipment, but moved with the measured precision of scientists rather than soldiers. The leader, a woman with silver hair pulled back severely, gestured toward the adjoining laboratories. Harold recognized her immediately. Dr. Sarah Chen, his former research partner and the only person besides himself who understood the true scope of Project Morpheus. The woman who'd vanished without explanation 3 days after the project's termination. "Biosignatures are stable," Chen's voice carried clearly through the facility's acoustics. "We can proceed with the extraction." "The old man's been here recently," replied one of her companions, examining a computer terminal. His access card was used 40 minutes ago. Chen's expression remained unchanged. Harold always was predictable. He's probably skulking around the containment level, playing guardian angel to his precious monster. Harold's jaw tightened. Monster. After all these years, she still saw Subject 23 as nothing more than an aberration to be studied and exploited. She'd never understood what they'd really accomplished, or the terrible price of their success. The team moved deeper into the complex, their voices fading as they descended toward the primary research stations. Harold waited until silence returned before emerging from his hiding place. He needed to reach the central command center, but Chen's presence changed everything. She knew the facility's layout as well as he did, and she clearly had resources he couldn't match. Harold's fingers found the emergency lockdown controls hidden beneath the main console. One flip of the switch would seal every door and corridor, trapping Chen's team inside. But it would also trap him, and more importantly, it would alert them to his exact location. Instead, he began uploading a virus into the facility's security network, a little gift he'd prepared decades ago for exactly this scenario. The malicious code would slowly corrupt the environmental controls, making the underground complex increasingly uninhabitable. Chen might have come prepared for a quick extraction, but she wouldn't be able to sustain a prolonged occupation. As the upload completed, Harold heard the distant sound of heavy machinery coming online. Chen's team was activating the primary research equipment, preparing to wake something that had slumbered peacefully for nearly half a century. Harold closed his eyes and whispered a prayer to whatever gods watched over foolish old scientists. Then he began his descent toward the heart of the facility, where Subject 23 waited in its dreams of electric sheep and quantum nightmares. The steel door groaned as Harold forced it open wider, the sound echoing through the abandoned corridors like a death rattle. Behind him, Sarah Chen adjusted her headlamp beam, casting dancing shadows across walls that hadn't seen light in decades. The air hung thick with the metallic taste of old secrets and decay. "Jesus," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of emergency lighting that had somehow maintained power after all these years. "How deep does this go?" Harold's weathered hands trembled slightly as he traced the familiar concrete walls. 7 levels, maybe 8 if they finished the deep storage. His voice carried the weight of memories he'd tried to bury. "We called it Prometheus Base. Should have named it Pandora's Box." They moved deeper into the facility, their footsteps creating an unsettling rhythm against the sterile floors. Sarah's camera captured everything: the pristine laboratory equipment behind reinforced glass, the endless rows of filing cabinets, the warning signs in languages that predated modern classification systems. "Harold," she said, stopping at a blast door marked with symbols that made her skin crawl, "what exactly were you all working on down here?" The old man paused at a security checkpoint, his fingers automatically moving to a keypad despite the decades that had passed. The numbers came to him like muscle memory: 071,953, the date they'd first made contact. "We thought we were saving the world," he said as the blast door cycled open with a pneumatic hiss. Cold War paranoia ran deep. The government was convinced the Soviets had found something, some kind of technological advantage. Turned out we weren't the only ones who'd been visited. Sarah's blood chilled. Visited by who? The corridor beyond the blast door was different. The walls here weren't concrete, but something that seemed to shimmer with an inner light, almost organic in its texture. Equipment lined the passageway, devices that looked simultaneously ancient and impossibly advanced. "The travelers," Harold said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "That's what we called them. They'd been coming here for decades, maybe centuries. Always to this spot, always to that oak tree. We detected the energy signatures in 1951, started digging in 52. They entered a vast chamber that took Sarah's breath away. The space was larger than a cathedral, carved from living rock and lined with technology that defied description. In the center stood a circular platform, surrounded by what could only be described as a gateway. a ring of metallic substance that seemed to bend light around itself. "My God," Sarah breathed. "This is what they're killing for." Harold nodded grimly. "The gateway is still active, has been for 70 years. We never figured out how to shut it down, and frankly, we were too terrified to try. The travelers used it to come and go. Sometimes they'd bring things back with them. Technologies, information, warnings." Sarah approached the platform carefully, her equipment registering energy readings that shouldn't exist according to any known physics. "What kind of warnings?" "About us, about what we'd become if we weren't careful." Harold's eyes were distant, lost in memories of impossible conversations with beings that existed beyond human understanding. They weren't conquerors, Sarah. They were gardeners, trying to cultivate something better in the species they encountered. A sound from the corridor behind them made both freeze. Footsteps, multiple sets, moving with military precision. Harold's face went pale as he recognized the tactical rhythm. "Blackwood," he whispered. "They found us." Sarah grabbed her equipment, but Harold caught her arm. "No, this way." He led her to what appeared to be a solid wall, but his hand found a hidden control panel. Another section of the chamber opened, revealing a service tunnel. The facility was designed with multiple escape routes, he explained, as they crawled through the narrow passage. "We learned that from them. Always have an exit strategy." Behind them, voices echoed in the main chamber. Professional, calm, deadly. "Sweep every level. They're here somewhere. Sir, the gateway is showing increased activity. I don't care if God himself comes through that thing. Find Harold Morrison and the reporter. Our orders are clear." Harold and Sarah emerged into another corridor 3 levels down. Here, the walls were lined with what looked like stasis pods, each one containing something that made Sarah's rational mind recoil. "Specimens," Harold explained, seeing her expression. Not all the travelers were friendly. Some were refugees fleeing something worse. Others were predators. We learned to tell the difference. One of the pods was empty, its transparent surface cracked. "Harold," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear, "how long since you've been down here?" The old man stared at the broken pod, recognition and terror warring in his eyes. 43 years. But that pod was intact when I left. Above them, something that wasn't quite human began to scream. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Harold made his way through the facility's main corridor, each footstep echoing in the sterile silence. 47 years had passed since he'd last walked these halls, yet muscle memory guided him past abandoned workstations and sealed laboratory doors. The air still carried that distinctive metallic scent of ozone and fear. He paused at Laboratory 7, his trembling hand hovering over the biometric scanner. The red light blinked expectantly, waiting for authorization that should have expired decades ago. Harold pressed his palm against the cool surface and held his breath. A soft beep, then green. The heavy door slid open with a pneumatic hiss. Inside, everything remained exactly as he'd left it that final night in 1976. Computer terminals sat dark and silent, their screens reflecting his weathered face like black mirrors. Specimen containers lined the walls, their contents long since deteriorated into unrecognizable organic matter. But it wasn't the equipment that drew his attention. It was the vault at the far end of the room. The combination lock hadn't been changed. Harold's fingers moved automatically. August 15th, 2045. The day the world learned what atomic fire could do to human flesh. How fitting that they'd chosen that date to lock away their other abomination. The vault door swung open, revealing shelves lined with sealed containers and thick manila folders. Harold reached for the file marked Project Lazarus, Final Report, and felt the weight of decades pressing down on his shoulders. Inside were photographs that still made his stomach turn, subjects writhing in containment cells, their bodies caught between life and something else entirely. Notes in his own handwriting described cellular regeneration rates that defied every law of biology. They'd called it the ultimate weapon, soldiers who couldn't die, who would keep fighting no matter how much damage they sustained. What they'd created instead was a nightmare that still haunted Harold's dreams. A sound from the corridor made him freeze. Footsteps, deliberate and measured. Harold quickly gathered the most critical files and sealed the vault. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the soft crackle of radio static. Lower levels secured. No sign of the target. Harold's blood ran cold. They'd found the facility. He slipped through a maintenance door just as armed figures appeared at the far end of the corridor. In the darkness of the ventilation shaft, he could hear them moving through the laboratory, their tactical boots grinding against debris. "Sir, we've got fresh palm prints on the scanner. He's definitely been here." Harold crawled through the narrow space, his knees protesting against the metal surface. Behind him, he could hear the intruders discussing their search pattern. Somehow, they knew about the facility's layout. Either they had the original blueprints or they'd been here before. The ventilation shaft emerged in the facility's power room, where massive generators sat silent and covered in dust. Harold dropped down carefully, wincing at the sharp pain in his joints. He needed to reach the emergency exit before they expanded their search. But first he had to ensure no one else could access what lay hidden in the deeper levels. The emergency protocols were still functional. Harold activated the lockdown sequence, sealing the lower sections behind blast doors that would take specialized equipment to breach. As alarms began to wail throughout the facility, he heard shouts from the corridors above. He's activated containment protocols. Move to the emergency exits. Harold ran, clutching the stolen files against his chest. The emergency tunnel stretched ahead of him, a concrete throat that led to freedom. Behind him, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. These weren't government agents. Their tactics were too aggressive, their methods too crude. Private military contractors, most likely, hired by someone who wanted Harold and his secrets eliminated permanently. The tunnel exit opened onto a rocky outcropping half a mile from his cabin. Harold emerged into the mountain air, gasping and disoriented. The sun had climbed higher during his time underground, casting harsh shadows across the forest. He needed to get back to his truck, but first he had to contact someone who would understand the magnitude of what they were dealing with. Sarah, the journalist, had been asking the right questions, probing into classified projects that most people believed were conspiracy theories. If something happened to him, she might be the only one capable of exposing the truth. Harold made his way through the trees, staying off the established trails. The files in his arms contained evidence of crimes against humanity, experiments that violated every treaty and moral principle. But they also contained something else: documentation of the one successful test subject who had escaped containment in 1976. Subject 17 was still out there somewhere, neither fully alive nor properly dead. And if Harold's calculations were correct, the cellular degradation process would have accelerated by now. The creature that had once been a volunteer soldier would be desperately seeking a way to stabilize its condition. Someone wanted to find Subject 17. Someone with enough resources to hire military contractors and enough knowledge to locate the abandoned facility. Harold suspected he knew exactly who that someone was, and the thought filled him with a terror that 47 years of isolation hadn't been able to diminish. The silence stretched between Harold and Sarah like a chasm filled with decades of buried truth. Harold's weathered hands trembled as he reached into his jacket pocket, withdrawing a small, leather-bound journal that looked as ancient as the oak tree above them. The facility's emergency lighting cast dancing shadows across the yellowed pages as he opened it. "Project Lazarus," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the backup generators. "That's what they called it. What we called it." He looked up at Sarah, his eyes reflecting a pain that had festered for 50 years. "I was 24 when they recruited me, fresh out of MIT with a doctorate in biochemistry and enough arrogance to believe I could change the world." Sarah stepped closer, her weapon still drawn but lowered. What kind of experiment required this level of secrecy, this level of burial? Harold's laugh was bitter, hollow, the kind that promised to end death itself. He turned several pages in the journal, revealing detailed diagrams and formulas written in multiple hands. We were trying to create a serum that could reverse cellular aging, halt the dying process, even bring back the recently deceased. The military applications were extensive. The weight of his words settled over them like dust. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as the implications became clear. You were trying to create super soldiers, immortal ones. Among other things, Harold closed the journal and began walking deeper into the facility, past the observation rooms they'd already explored. But we discovered something else entirely, something that made our original goals seem quaint by comparison. They entered a section of the facility Sarah hadn't seen before, where the walls were lined with what appeared to be suspended animation chambers. Most were empty, their glass fronts fogged with age, but several still contained dark shapes that might once have been human. The serum worked, Harold continued, his footsteps echoing in the sterile corridor. But not in the way we expected. Instead of preventing death, it created something that existed in the space between life and death, something that could think, move, even communicate, but wasn't truly alive in any sense we understood. Sarah felt her skin crawl as they passed the occupied chambers. Through the condensation on the glass, she could make out the vague outlines of figures that seemed somehow wrong, as if their proportions had been subtly altered by whatever process had been done to them. How many? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. 43 subjects total. 27 survived the initial process. Harold stopped in front of a chamber that bore the designation Subject 001. The nameplate below read Dr. Margaret Chen, lead researcher. Margaret volunteered to be the first human trial. She believed so deeply in the work that she was willing to risk everything. Through the glass, Sarah could see the shadowy outline of a woman, perfectly preserved but unmistakably changed. There was something about the proportions of her limbs, the angle of her head, that suggested she was aware of their presence. She's still alive in there? Sarah's voice cracked. Alive isn't the right word. Conscious, perhaps, trapped between states of being. Harold's hand pressed against the glass, and Sarah could swear she saw the figure inside respond with the slightest movement. When the government realized what we had created, they wanted to weaponize it. An army of beings that couldn't die, couldn't be killed by conventional means, could operate in environments that would kill normal soldiers. But you refused. We tried to destroy everything. Margaret, Dr. Kowalski, Dr. Rahman, and myself. We thought we could contain it, bury it, make it disappear. Harold turned away from the chamber, his shoulders sagging. The others died in the attempt. Officially, it was a laboratory accident, gas leak. I was the only survivor because I was in a different section when the explosion occurred. Sarah followed him as he continued down the corridor, but someone knew the truth, someone who wanted to restart the project. For 50 years I've been the guardian of this place, the only one who knew the location, the only one who understood the true scope of what was buried here. Harold stopped at a heavy door marked with biohazard symbols. But recently, someone has been asking questions, making inquiries about the original research team, about me, the people who tried to kill you. They're not just trying to kill me, Sarah. They're trying to extract information. They want to know about the serum, about the process, about everything we learned down here. Harold placed his palm on a scanner beside the door, and it hissed open. And I'm afraid they might be willing to wake up our sleeping subjects to get what they want. Beyond the door lay another chamber, larger than the others, containing equipment that looked far more recent than anything else they'd seen. Fresh boot prints marked the dusty floor, and several computer terminals glowed with active displays. Someone had been here recently, someone who had found another way in. The metallic taste of blood filled Harold's mouth as he pressed himself against the cold concrete wall of the facility's main corridor. His hearing aid picked up the distant echo of boots on metal stairs, at least 3 sets, maybe 4. They'd found the entrance faster than he'd hoped. Sarah crouched beside him, her face pale in the emergency lighting. How many ways out of here? 2, Harold whispered. wiping blood from his split lip. "The way we came, and an emergency tunnel that leads to the old mine shaft about half a mile northeast. But that one," he hesitated, "that one goes through the containment area." "What's in containment?" Harold's weathered hands trembled as he pulled the security badge from his shirt pocket. After 50 years, the magnetic strip might not even work. What we couldn't destroy, what we should have destroyed. The sound of boots grew closer, accompanied by the metallic click of weapons being readied. Sarah grabbed Harold's arm. "We need to move, now!" They hurried deeper into the facility, Harold's memory guiding them through corridors that hadn't seen human footsteps in decades. The emergency lighting cast long shadows that seemed to reach for them as they passed. Harold's joints protested every step, but adrenaline kept him moving. "Harold Chen," a voice boomed through hidden speakers, making them both freeze. "I know you're in there. We have the entire facility surrounded." Harold recognized the voice immediately. Director Peterson's protege, Marcus Webb, the ambitious young analyst who'd been asking too many questions in those final months before the project was officially terminated. 30 years I've been looking for this place," Webb's voice continued. 30 years cleaning up the loose ends from Project Lazarus. You're the last one, Harold, the last one who knows where the real data is stored." Sarah looked at Harold with growing alarm. "Real data? I thought you said everything was destroyed." "The experimental data was," Harold said, swiping his badge at a security door. The light flickered red, then green. "But the theoretical framework, the mathematical models, those are stored in the quantum drives in the core facility. Webb must think he can monetize it somehow." They pushed through the door into what had once been the project's nerve center. Banks of ancient computers lined the walls, their screens dark and silent. But in the center of the room stood something that made Sarah gasp, a cylindrical chamber filled with a faintly glowing blue liquid. "Jesus Christ, Harold, what is that thing?" Harold approached the chamber with the reverence of a man visiting a grave. Inside the liquid, barely visible, was a shape that might once have been human. Subject 12, the only one who survived the full transformation process. We called him Adam. The liquid in the chamber began to swirl, and the shape inside shifted slightly. Sarah stepped back. "It's still alive?" "Alive. Dead." Those terms stopped having meaning after the third day of the experiment. Harold's voice carried the weight of decades of guilt. "We were trying to create the perfect soldier, someone who could survive in any environment, regenerate from any injury. Instead, we created something that exists in a state between life and death." The sound of the security door being forced open echoed behind them. Webb's team had reached the core facility. "The emergency tunnel is behind that wall," Harold said, pointing to what appeared to be solid concrete. "But we have to activate the chamber's fail-safe first." "What fail-safe?" Harold was already at the main console, his fingers dancing over controls he hadn't touched in half a century. "If the chamber is breached without proper shutdown procedures, Adam's cellular structure will destabilize. The resulting chain reaction will destroy everything within a 2-mile radius." "You're talking about a bomb." "I'm talking about making sure this nightmare never sees daylight." Harold's eyes met hers. "Webb doesn't just want the data, Sarah. He wants Adam. Imagine that thing replicated, mass-produced, turned into an army." The security door burst open, and armed figures in tactical gear poured into the chamber. Webb appeared among them, older now but still carrying himself with the same arrogant confidence Harold remembered. "Step away from the console, Harold," Webb ordered, his weapon trained on the old scientist. "You've caused enough trouble." "Trouble?" Harold laughed bitterly. "I've spent 50 years making sure this abomination stayed buried. You want to dig it up and play God all over again." The liquid in the chamber was swirling faster now, and the shape of Adam was becoming more distinct. Harold's fingers hovered over the final sequence of keys. "You press those keys, and you'll kill your friend here too," Webb said, gesturing toward Sarah. "Is your conscience really prepared for one more death?" Harold's hand shook as he looked at Sarah, then at the chamber, then at Webb's confident smile. The weight of every decision he'd made since 1973 pressed down on his shoulders like a physical force. The shape in the chamber pressed against the glass, and for the first time in 50 years, Harold saw Adam's eyes open. Harold's hands trembled as he inserted the final authorization key into the containment system. The facility's emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red, and the ambient temperature had risen noticeably in the past hour. Through the reinforced observation window, he could see the specimen pods beginning to show stress fractures along their seals. 60 years, he whispered to himself. 60 years I've kept you contained. The neural interface headset felt heavier than he remembered as he lowered it over his grey hair. The contact points found their familiar positions against his skull, and immediately his vision filled with cascading data streams. Biological readings, containment integrity reports, power grid status, all of it flowing directly into his consciousness through the obsolete but still functional technology. Marcus Holloway's voice crackled through the facility's intercom system. "Dr. Brennan, I know you're down there. My thermal imaging shows 3 heat signatures in that mountain, and 2 of them are moving toward the lower levels." Sarah Chen was somewhere in the maze of corridors above, probably trying to reach the main laboratory. Harold had sent her to retrieve the original research data while he handled the containment protocols. If something went wrong, when something went wrong, the world would need to know what they had discovered here. The neural link synchronized fully, and Harold's awareness expanded throughout the facility. He could feel every system, every failing component, every crack in the containment barriers. The specimens weren't just breaking free from their physical restraints, they were actively working to compromise the entire containment grid from the inside. That's what terrified him most. These weren't mindless organisms. They had learned, adapted, evolved during their decades of imprisonment. The neural patterns he was detecting through the monitoring equipment showed levels of coordination and intelligence that far exceeded their original baseline measurements. A proximity alarm chimed softly in his enhanced awareness. Someone had breached the upper security checkpoint. Harold split his attention between the containment systems and the facility's internal sensors, tracking the intruder's movement through the complex. Not Sarah. The movement pattern was too aggressive, too purposeful. Holloway had found another way inside. Harold activated the facility's defensive protocols, systems that hadn't been used since the original research team had abandoned the project. Blast doors sealed critical sections, and security barriers dropped into place throughout the underground complex. He wouldn't let Holloway reach the specimens, no matter what the man's true intentions were. The neural interface fed him another, disturbing data point. The specimen's electromagnetic signatures were fluctuating in synchronized patterns. They were communicating with each other, coordinating their escape attempts across multiple containment pods. "Sarah," Harold spoke aloud, knowing the facility's communication system would carry his voice to speakers throughout the complex. "Whatever you do, don't approach the specimen chambers. They're more active than I've ever seen them." Through the security cameras, he watched Sarah navigate the darkened corridors of Level 3, moving steadily toward the main laboratory where the original research files were stored. She moved with surprising confidence for someone experiencing this place for the first time, following the path markers he had described to her earlier. A violent impact shook the entire facility. Harold's enhanced awareness immediately identified the source. Holloway was using explosives to breach the sealed sections. The man was either desperate or completely reckless, possibly both. Using high explosives in a facility containing unknown biological specimens was exactly the kind of catastrophic thinking that had led to the project's termination in the first place. The containment pod closest to Harold's position began emitting a low, rhythmic vibration. Through the neural link, he could perceive the specimen inside pressing against the barriers, testing their integrity with methodical precision. The creature had grown since the last time Harold had dared to examine it directly. What had once been roughly human-sized now filled nearly the entire pod. Another explosion, closer this time. Harold felt the shock wave through both the facility's sensors and his own body. Dust rained from the ceiling, and several secondary systems dropped offline. The containment grid flickered momentarily before the backup power systems kicked in. He couldn't maintain the neural link much longer. The technology was decades old, and his aging brain wasn't handling the data load as efficiently as it once had. Already he could feel the familiar burning sensation behind his eyes, the warning sign that the interface was pushing beyond safe operational parameters. But he had to hold on long enough to give Sarah time to reach the research data, and for both of them to escape. The specimens couldn't be allowed to break free, but if that became inevitable, someone had to survive to warn the world about what was coming. Through the security feeds, Harold watched Holloway emerge from a cloud of smoke and debris, assault rifle in hand, moving systematically toward the containment levels. The man's face was set in determined lines, but Harold detected something else in his expression: fear. Marcus Holloway knew exactly what was down here, and he was afraid of it too. The steel door to Laboratory 7 hung open like a wound in the earth, its edges still warm from the thermite charge Harold had detonated. Sarah pressed herself against the concrete wall beside him, her breathing rapid in the recycled air. The emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red, making the familiar corridors of his past look like the entrance to some technological underworld. "How many more are down there?" Sarah whispered, checking her pistol's magazine. Harold studied the schematics burned into his memory from 40 years ago. Hard to say. The facility was designed for a skeleton crew of 12, but Meridian could have brought in additional personnel. He paused, listening to the distant hum of machinery. "The main server room is 3 levels down. If we can reach it." A burst of automatic gunfire echoed from somewhere in the depths below, followed by shouting. Harold felt his blood chill. They weren't the only ones fighting down there. "Someone else is in the facility," Sarah said, voicing his thoughts. Harold nodded grimly. The other survivors. Meridian must have finally located them. He shouldered his pack and started down the metal staircase. "Which means we're running out of time." The first sub-level contained what had once been the administrative offices, a maze of cubicles and conference rooms now covered in decades of dust. Harold moved carefully, his weathered hands steady despite his age. Behind him, Sarah followed with the fluid grace of someone trained for urban warfare. They'd made it halfway across the floor when the lights went out. Emergency power kicked in a second later, bathing everything in that ominous red glow again. In the distance, Harold could hear the distinctive whine of the facility's lockdown protocols engaging. Blast doors would be sealing throughout the complex, compartmentalizing each section. "They're trying to trap us," Sarah breathed. "No," Harold said, his mind racing through the facility's security systems. "They're trying to contain something, or someone." A scream echoed from the stairwell they'd just descended, high, terrified, and abruptly cut short. Harold felt the years fall away as combat instincts he'd thought buried forever surged back to life. The Harold Whitmore, who'd been a young research scientist, had died in these tunnels 40 years ago. What had emerged was someone harder, more capable of the choices that survival demanded. "This way," he whispered, leading Sarah toward a maintenance corridor he remembered from the building's original plans. The narrow passage was cramped, forcing them to move single file through a maze of pipes and electrical conduits. Harold's joints protested, but he pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that every minute they delayed was another chance for Meridian to complete whatever they'd started. They emerged on the second sublevel into what had once been the medical wing. Harold's breath caught as they passed the door to Operating Theatre 3. Behind that reinforced steel lay memories he'd spent 4 decades trying to forget, the volunteers who'd trusted them, the procedures that had pushed the boundaries of human experimentation, the moment when everything had gone terribly wrong. "Harold," Sarah's voice was tight with tension. "Motion sensors are picking up movement ahead. Multiple contacts." He looked where she pointed. Through the reinforced glass window of the main laboratory, he could see figures moving in the darkness. One of them turned toward the window, and Harold's heart nearly stopped. Dr. Elena Vasquez. She was older now, her dark hair silver, but unmistakably the brilliant neurochemist who'd been his closest collaborator on the project. She was supposed to be dead. They'd all been supposed to be dead. Elena saw him through the glass, and her eyes widened in recognition. She mouthed a single word: "Run!" The laboratory door exploded outward in a shower of glass and twisted metal. Through the smoke came figures in black tactical gear, moving with inhuman coordination. But it was their eyes that made Harold's blood turn to ice, completely black, reflecting the emergency lighting like polished obsidian. "The subjects," he whispered. "Dear God, they perfected the process." The enhanced operatives turned toward them with predatory focus. Harold grabbed Sarah's arm and ran, his 74-year-old body protesting every step. Behind them, he could hear the sound of pursuit, not running footsteps, but something faster, more fluid. "The stairwell!" Sarah shouted, firing 3 quick shots over her shoulder. They reached the emergency stairs just as the lights went out again. In the darkness, Harold could hear Elena screaming from somewhere behind them, her cries echoing through the facility's corridors like a ghost from his past. As they descended toward the 3rd sublevel and the server room that held the only chance of exposing Meridian's crimes, Harold realized the terrible truth. The project hadn't failed 40 years ago, it had succeeded, and now those successes were hunting them through the depths of a facility that had become their tomb. The emergency lighting flickered back on, and Harold saw something that made his heart sink. Fresh bloodstains on the walls, leading deeper into the complex. They weren't just walking into a trap, they were walking into a slaughterhouse. The elevator descended into darkness, its ancient mechanisms groaning with each foot they dropped beneath the mountain. Harold's weathered hands trembled as he gripped the brass safety rail, memories flooding back with each familiar sound, the hiss of hydraulics, the metallic scrape of cables, the subtle change in air pressure that meant they were approaching level 7. Sarah Chen stood beside him, her federal badge clipped to her jacket, studying his face in the dim overhead light. "How long has it been since you've been down here?" 43 years, 2 months, 16 days. Harold's voice was barely audible above the elevator's mechanical symphony. "The day I sealed it." The elevator shuddered to a halt, and Harold hesitated before reaching for the gate. Beyond the accordion metal barrier lay the corridor he'd walked in his nightmares for decades. Sterile white walls, fluorescent fixtures that had long since burned out, and doors marked with symbols that had been classified above top secret. "Dr. Kellerman," Sarah said quietly, using his real name for the first time since she'd arrived at his cabin 12 hours ago. "Whatever we find down here, you need to know that Director Morrison isn't the only one involved. The people hunting you have resources, connections at the highest levels." Harold pulled the gate open, and stale air rushed out carrying the scent of dust, ozone, and something else, something organic and wrong. His stomach clenched. "That's because some of them were here. Some of them know what we created." Their footsteps echoed as they moved down the main corridor, Sarah's flashlight beam dancing across numbered doors. Harold's memory supplied the contents behind each: psychometric testing chambers, sensory deprivation tanks, the room where they'd first detected the resonance frequencies that could alter human consciousness. "Room 14, Harold whispered, stopping before a door marked with a biohazard symbol. "That's where it started, where we first made contact." Sarah's beam illuminated the magnetic lock, its red light still blinking after all these years. "The emergency power is still running." Harold pressed his palm against a scanner beside the door. For a moment, nothing happened, and he wondered if the system would still recognize him after 4 decades. Then the lock disengaged with a soft click. The door swung open to reveal a circular chamber dominated by a massive apparatus that resembled a metallic tree growing from floor to ceiling. Crystalline nodes studded its branches, each one connected to bundles of fiber optic cables that pulsed with faint blue light. "Jesus Christ," Sarah breathed. "What is that thing?" "Project Mindbridge," Harold said, his voice heavy with decades of guilt. "We thought we were developing telepathic communication technology. enhanced interrogation capabilities. What we actually built was a doorway. The apparatus hummed softly, its crystals flickering in patterns that seemed almost like neural activity. Sarah stepped closer, and Harold grabbed her arm. "Don't. Even after all this time, it's still active, still listening." He pointed to a bank of monitors along the far wall, their screens displaying cascading data streams. "We thought we were studying extrasensory perception in human subjects. But the subjects weren't generating the signals we detected. They were receiving them. From where?" Harold's finger trembled as he pointed to a schematic on the wall showing the mountain's geological cross-section. Red lines penetrated deep into the earth, far below the facility. "There's something down there, something that's been waiting. We opened a channel to it in 1979, and it's been whispering to people ever since." Sarah's radio crackled to life, making them both jump. Static filled the chamber, but beneath it, Harold could hear something else, a rhythmic pattern that made his teeth ache. "It knows we're here," he whispered. "That's how Morrison found me, how he's been tracking the other survivors. The entity, it can influence anyone who's been exposed to the resonance frequencies." The humming grew louder, and the crystalline nodes began to pulse in unison. On the monitors, the data streams accelerated, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. "We have to shut it down," Sarah said, but Harold was already shaking his head. "I tried. For decades I've been trying to figure out how to sever the connection without releasing what's down there. Every time someone gets close to the truth, the entity influences key people to eliminate them. Morrison, the assassination teams, they're all just extensions of its will now." The radio static resolved into a voice, Morrison's voice, but wrong somehow, speaking in harmonics that no human throat could produce. "Harold, you can't run forever. You can't hide from what you helped create. Come home to us. Let us finish what we started." Sarah drew her weapon, though Harold knew it would be useless against what they faced. The crystal nodes were glowing brighter now, and somewhere in the depths below, something vast and patient was stirring to wakefulness after decades of dreaming. They had perhaps minutes before Morrison's people found the entrance. Less time before the entity decided to stop being subtle about its influence on the world above. Harold reached for the emergency containment protocols, praying that 43 years of preparation would be enough. The static on Harold's old radio crackled through the cabin as he adjusted the frequency, searching for any government chatter about the facility. 3 days had passed since he'd destroyed the remaining Phoenix samples, but he knew Director Walsh wouldn't give up easily. The man had spent 30 years climbing the intelligence hierarchy, and Harold's defiance represented more than just a scientific setback. It was a direct challenge to Walsh's authority. Sarah sat across from him at the kitchen table, her laptop open as she compiled the evidence they'd gathered. Photos of the underground laboratory, documentation of the experiments, testimonials from the families of test subjects, everything needed to expose Phoenix to the world. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, but Harold could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "We need to get this story out before they find us," she said, not looking up from her screen. "I've contacted 3 major news outlets, but they all want more verification. Government cover-up stories are hard to sell without ironclad proof." Harold turned the radio dial again, catching fragments of conversations between federal agents. They were closing in, establishing a perimeter around the mountain. He estimated they had maybe 6 hours before the net tightened completely. "There's someone who can verify everything," Harold said quietly. "Dr. Elizabeth Chen. She was my research partner on Phoenix. If she's still alive, her testimony would be undeniable." Sarah's head snapped up. "You never mentioned her before." "'Cause I thought she was dead. We were told she died in a car accident 6 months after the project ended. But I've been thinking, Walsh has been remarkably well informed about Phoenix details that only the core team would know, details that weren't in the official records." The implication hung heavy between them. If Chen was alive, if she'd been working with Walsh all these years, it would explain how he'd maintained such intimate knowledge of the project's secrets. It would also mean Harold's oldest friend had betrayed everything they'd once stood for. Sarah pulled up a People Search website, her fingers flying across the keys. Elizabeth Chen, biochemist, age 71. Holy shit, Harold. She's listed as a senior consultant for Meridian Biotech. That's a government contractor specializing in classified research. Harold's stomach dropped. Meridian had been mentioned in some of the documents they'd found in the facility. Chen wasn't just alive, she was still working on Phoenix derivatives. The radio suddenly burst with clear voices. Federal agents were moving up the Eastern Trail, less than 2 miles away. Harold grabbed his hunting rifle from above the fireplace and checked the ammunition. He'd been a mountain man for decades, but the weight of the weapon felt foreign in his arthritic hands. "We need to leave." "Now," he said. Sarah was already packing her laptop and the evidence files into a waterproof messenger bag. "Where can we go? They'll have the roads blocked." Harold moved to the window, scanning the tree line through his binoculars. Black SUVs were visible on the distant logging road, and he could make out tactical teams positioning themselves around his property. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They were approaching from the valleys, not the peaks. "There's an old mining trail on the north face," he said. "It leads down to the highway about 15 miles from here. The terrain's too rough for vehicles, and most people don't even know it exists." They gathered supplies quickly: water, emergency food, warm clothes, and the evidence that could expose Phoenix to the world. Harold took one last look around his cabin, knowing he'd never see it again. 40 years of solitude, ended by the very secret he'd been protecting. They slipped out the back door, just as the sun disappeared behind the western peaks. Harold led the way up a steep deer path, his legs protesting every step, but his mind sharp with purpose. Behind them, voices echoed through the trees as the federal agents closed in on the empty cabin. Sarah struggled with the altitude and rough terrain, but she kept pace without complaint. The evidence bag bounced against her hip with each step, its contents representing the only chance they had to expose the truth before Walsh silenced them permanently. After an hour of climbing, they reached the old mining trail Harold remembered from his younger days. The path was overgrown and treacherous, but it would take them away from the federal dragnet and toward civilization. "Harold," Sarah gasped, pausing to catch her breath. "If Dr. Chen is still alive, still working on Phoenix, what does that mean?" Harold stopped walking, the terrible realization crystallizing in his mind. Walsh hadn't just been trying to recover the original samples, he'd been protecting an active program, one that had never really ended. "It means," Harold said slowly, "that Phoenix isn't just history, it's still happening." The sound of helicopters echoed across the mountain as searchlights began sweeping the forest below. They had to keep moving, had to reach the highway before dawn, because now they weren't just carrying evidence of past crimes, they were racing to prevent future ones. The electromagnetic pulse hit the facility like a thunderclap, plunging everything into absolute darkness. Harold felt the familiar weight of the emergency flashlight in his coat pocket, muscle memory from decades of preparing for this moment. As the beam cut through the blackness, he saw Sarah pressed against the wall, her face pale with shock. "What just happened?" she whispered. "The failsafe," Harold replied grimly. "Someone's trying to wipe the servers remotely." The sound of boots echoed from the main corridor above. Multiple sets, moving with military precision. Harold's blood ran cold as he recognized the cadence, Delta formation, just like they'd trained back in '73. "This way," he hissed, grabbing Sarah's arm and leading her deeper into the facility's bowels. His arthritic joints protested, but adrenaline override the pain. They had minutes, maybe less. The emergency lighting flickered on, bathing everything in hellish red. Harold's flashlight beam danced across walls lined with dormant cryogenic chambers, each one a testament to the project's true scope. Sarah gasped as they passed a row of observation windows, behind which shapes floated in amber-colored suspension fluid. "Harold, what are those?" Her voice cracked. "Test subjects. Volunteers, they told us." But after Kowalski started asking questions, he left the sentence hanging. Some truths were too heavy to bear while running for your life. They reached a junction where 3 corridors met. Harold paused, consulting a mental map he'd carried for 40 years. The sound of boots was closer now, accompanied by the distinctive whine of tactical equipment powering up. They'd brought scanners, thermal imaging. These weren't local mercenaries, this was a full government cleanup crew. Left, Harold decided, steering them toward what looked like a dead end. There's something you need to see before they destroy it all. The corridor terminated in a vault door, marked with biohazard symbols and warnings in 3 languages. Harold pressed his palm against an ancient scanner, praying the backup power would hold. The door groaned open, revealing a chamber that seemed to exist outside normal space and time. The walls pulsed with a faint luminescence that had nothing to do with electricity. In the center of the room stood a cylindrical apparatus 15 feet tall, its surface covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. The air itself seemed to vibrate with potential energy. The resonance engine, Harold breathed. The real purpose of everything we did here. Sarah approached the device with scientific fascination overriding her fear. This technology, it's not from the 70s. It's not from this century. We found it buried under the mountain in 1969. A survey team drilling for mineral deposits broke through into a chamber that shouldn't have existed. The government moved fast to contain the discovery. The symbols on the device began to glow brighter, responding to their presence. Harold felt the familiar tingle in his cerebral cortex, the same sensation that had marked all the survivors of the original research team. It changes people, he continued, watching Sarah's pupils dilate as the engine's influence touched her mind. Enhances cognitive function, extends lifespan, but at a cost. We couldn't control who it affected or how. Half the research team developed brain hemorrhages. The other half became something else, Sarah finished, understanding flooding her features. She looked at Harold with new eyes. That's how you survived the assassination attempts, how you stayed sharp at 74. You've been exposed to this for decades. Footsteps rang from the corridor behind them. Tactical teams, moving fast and efficient. Harold estimated 3 minutes before they breached the vault. The engine isn't just alien technology, he said urgently. It's a communication device. Every enhancement it gives us makes us better receivers for whatever signal it's broadcasting. The government realized they couldn't shut it down without risking a response from wherever it came from. Sarah's hand hovered over a control panel that had activated when they entered. We could trigger a full resonance cascade, send a message back, and potentially doom our entire species. Harold's voice was heavy with the weight of decades-old decisions. That's the choice I've been guarding against my whole life. The vault door shuddered as something heavy impacted it from outside. Cutting torches began to hiss against the metal. They had minutes at most. Sarah looked between Harold and the engine, understanding the impossible position they were in. There has to be another option, some way to preserve the knowledge without triggering a response. Harold smiled sadly, feeling the years pressing down on him like a physical weight. The device pulsed brighter, as if sensing the approaching end of its long dormancy. There is, he said, moving toward a final control panel hidden behind the engine's base. But it requires a sacrifice. Someone has to stay behind to manually maintain the containment field while the others escape with the research. The cutting torches broke through the vault door's outer layer. Red sparks showered the chamber like burning stars, and through the gap Harold could see the cold eyes of soldiers who would kill anyone to keep this secret buried forever. The electromagnetic pulse hit the facility like a sledgehammer, plunging everything into absolute darkness. Emergency lighting flickered once, then died completely. In the suffocating blackness, Harold heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath and the distant hum of ventilation systems grinding to a halt. "The EMP device," Harold whispered, his voice barely audible in the sudden silence. "I built it into the facility's core systems decades ago. A failsafe." Marcus Volkov's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping frantically across the main laboratory. "You senile fool! Do you have any idea what you've done?" Harold's arthritic fingers found the backup control panel he'd memorized 40 years ago, muscle memory guiding him to switches that hadn't been touched since the project's supposed termination. I know exactly what I've done. The neural network is offline. The test subjects are free. A sound echoed through the corridors, something between a whisper and a wail, multiplied by dozens of voices. Sarah's hand found Harold's arm, her grip tight with fear. The sound grew louder, more coherent, as if scattered thoughts were suddenly coalescing into unified consciousness. "They're waking up," Volkov snarled, pulling a pistol from his jacket. "The sedation protocols are computerized. Without power, they remember everything," Harold finished. His weathered face was grim but determined in the dancing shadows of Volkov's flashlight. "Every experiment, every injection, every lie you told them about voluntary participation." The voices were closer now, echoing off metal walls with an otherworldly resonance. Sarah could make out words, fragments of names, dates, pleas for help that had gone unheeded for decades. Her journalistic instincts warred with pure terror as she realized she was witnessing the awakening of something that shouldn't exist. Volkov backed toward the exit tunnel, his weapon trained on Harold. "The backup generators will activate in 10 minutes. When they do, the containment protocols will re-engage automatically. This is temporary." Harold shook his head slowly. "There are no backup generators, Marcus. I disabled them before you arrived. This facility dies tonight. Then you've condemned them all. Without the neural inhibitors, their enhanced cognitive abilities will burn out their organic brain tissue within hours. They'll die in agony." A figure appeared at the laboratory's entrance, tall, gaunt, moving with unsettling fluidity. In the flashlight beam, Sarah caught a glimpse of a face that had once been human but now seemed stretched across dimensions her mind couldn't fully process. The enhanced test subject's eyes held an intelligence that was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. "Dr. Whitmore?" The voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate inside Sarah's skull. "We remember you. You tried to stop them." More figures emerged from the shadows, dozens of them, their movements synchronized in ways that defied normal human coordination. They had become something collectively greater than the sum of their individual parts, a shared consciousness that Volkov's experiments had created but never controlled. "Please," Harold said, stepping forward despite Sarah's attempt to hold him back. "I know what was done to you was unforgivable, but there are innocent people here. The young woman, she's a journalist trying to expose the truth about what happened." The lead figure tilted its head, studying Sarah with eyes that seemed to see through multiple spectrums of light simultaneously. "Truth. Yes. We understand truth now. All truths, simultaneously. Past, present, probable futures." Volkov raised his weapon. "Enough of this. I won't let 40 years of research be destroyed by sentiment." The shot echoed through the facility, but Harold was already moving, his old body responding with reflexes honed by decades of paranoia. The bullet meant for Sarah struck the concrete wall, sending chips of stone flying through the air. The enhanced subjects moved as one, surrounding Volkov with inhuman speed. Their collective voice filled the laboratory, no longer entirely human but somehow more compassionate than any normal person in that room. "We know you, Marcus Volkov. We remember every session, every adjustment to our neural pathways. We forgive you." Volkov's face contorted with rage and fear. "I don't want your forgiveness. I want my research." "Your research dies with us," the collective voice replied. "We choose to let go, to return to what we were before you tried to make us more." Harold watched in amazement as the enhanced subjects began to fade wasn't the right word, dissolve, releasing their collective consciousness back into individual human minds that could no longer sustain the burden of enhanced awareness. "The neural pathways are breaking down," he whispered to Sarah. "They're choosing to die as humans rather than live as something else." One by one, the test subjects collapsed, their faces peaceful for the first time in decades. The terrible intelligence in their eyes flickered and dimmed, replaced by something simpler but infinitely more precious. The confused but grateful recognition of people finally allowed to remember who they had been before the experiments began. In the growing silence, Sarah realized that the real story wasn't about the horror of what had been done to these people. It was about their final choice to reclaim their humanity, even at the cost of their lives. The morning sun filtered through the canopy as Harold stood before the ancient oak, its massive trunk scarred but enduring. Sarah Chen waited beside him, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder, while Agent Martinez positioned himself between them and the tree line, ever watchful despite the danger having passed. "You sure about this?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying the weight of everything they'd been through. Harold nodded, pulling the small detonator from his jacket pocket. The device felt heavier than its actual weight, laden with 70 years of secrets and guilt. "The world's moved on, Sarah. What we created down there, the neural mapping technology, the consciousness transfer protocols, it was meant to help humanity. Instead, it became a weapon." 3 days had passed since Director Blackwood's death in the underground facility. The official story would paint him as a rogue agent who'd been conducting unauthorized experiments. The truth about Project Mindbridge would die with the facility itself. But the potential applications, Sarah pressed, the medical breakthroughs we could achieve, would be perverted again. Harold interrupted gently. "I've seen what happens when science outpaces wisdom. The committee won't be the last group to covet this technology." Martinez's radio crackled. "Perimeter secure, sir. Cleanup crew is standing by at your signal." Harold had spent the past 3 days transferring what knowledge he deemed safe to Sarah's encrypted drives. The theoretical frameworks for neural interface design, the basic principles of consciousness mapping, but nothing that could be weaponized without decades of additional research. The dangerous applications, the completed protocols that had already claimed too many lives, would burn with the facility. "Dr. Kelman was right, wasn't he?" Sarah said quietly. "In his final transmission, he said the project had to die to be reborn clean." Harold's weathered hand tightened on the detonator. "Thomas understood before any of us did. Science without conscience is mankind's greatest threat." He looked at the oak tree, remembering the young idealist he'd once been. "I used to think knowledge was inherently good. That discovery justified any cost. And now? Now I know that some doors, once opened, can't be closed again. But sometimes you can burn down the house and start over." The charges he'd set weren't enough to harm the oak itself. The tree had weathered storms and decades, and it would outlast them all. But they would collapse the hidden entrance and bring down the first 3 levels of the facility. The automated systems would handle the rest, flooding the lower levels with an acid compound that would destroy every trace of their work. Sarah checked her watch. The other scientists from the original project, their families deserve to know what really happened. "They'll receive the truth," Harold assured her. "Sanitized, but truthful. Their loved ones died serving their country, and their sacrifice prevented something terrible from being unleashed. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was more than most classified projects ever revealed." Martinez approached them. "Sir, we need to move. The blast radius—" "I know." Harold took one last look at his property, the cabin where he'd spent decades in self-imposed exile, the workshop where he'd continued his research in harmless directions. After today, he couldn't return. Too many people knew about this place now. "Where will you go?" Sarah asked. Harold smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Somewhere warm. I've had enough of mountain winters." He paused, studying her face. "The offer stands, you know, the university position I mentioned. Someone needs to guide the next generation of researchers, teach them about responsibility. I'll consider it." Sarah's fingers drummed against her laptop bag. "The data you've shared, I'll be careful with it. I know you will." He'd chosen well. Sarah had the brilliance to understand the work and the wisdom to respect its dangers. The 3 of them walked away from the oak, reaching the safety perimeter Martinez had established. Harold turned back one final time, seeing not just the tree but the ghosts of his past. His younger self, filled with ambition and certainty, his colleagues, brilliant minds snuffed out by their own creation, the test subjects whose consciousness had been mapped, stored, and ultimately lost when the project went dark. "Goodbye, Thomas," he whispered. "Goodbye, Margaret. Goodbye to all of you." His thumb found the detonator's button. The device beeped once, confirming the signal. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground shuddered, a deep rumbling that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Dust puffed up around the oak's base as the hidden entrance collapsed. Far below, automated systems began their work of destruction. Harold Kellman, the last guardian of humanity's darkest scientific secret, finally allowed himself to feel something he hadn't experienced in 70 years, freedom. The mountain would keep its silence. The oak would stand sentinel over buried dreams and buried nightmares alike. And somewhere in the distance, the future waited.